Consciousness, it's this wild, rich experience of your own inner world, right? It's the feeling of what it's actually like to be you. But what is it really? Like, what's the absolute bare minimum that a system needs for that little inner light to just switch on? In this explainer, we're going to go searching for that very spark of awareness.
So let's just lay out the mission here. Scientists are tackling one of the biggest questions you can even imagine. What is the simplest possible thing in your brain, or maybe somewhere else, that actually creates an experience? It's basically a hunt for the fundamental recipe for being aware.
Okay, so the main clue that scientists are chasing is something they call the neural correlates of consciousness. You can just call them NCCs. Think of it like the brain's on switch for an experience. It's not just any old brain activity. It's the minimal set of things happening in your neurons that are absolutely required for you to consciously see or hear or feel anything at all.
To find these NCCs, we first have to line up the main suspects. And in the world of consciousness science, there are two huge leading theories. And, they point investigators in completely different directions.
So first up is the global neuronal workspace theory. This one suggests that consciousness is kind of like a theater. There's all this stuff happening unconsciously, behind the scenes. But when one piece of information is super important, it gets put up on a global workspace, like a spotlight on a stage, mainly in the front parts of the brain. That act of broadcasting it so everything else can see it, that is the conscious experience.
Then we have our second major suspect, integrated information theory, or IIT. And what's so fascinating about this one is that it completely flips the script. Instead of starting with the brain and asking, how does this thing make a mind? IIT starts with your experience right now. It says, hey, think about your own consciousness. It feels like one whole thing. It's super specific. So what kind of physical stuff could possibly create an experience that feels like that?
And this right here just lays out the fundamental difference perfectly. GNW starts with the hardware of the brain and asks, how does this machine make consciousness? IIT starts with the software of your experience and asks, what kind of machine could possibly run this program? They're two totally different starting lines for the exact same race.
Okay, so we've got these competing theories, but how do scientists actually go out and hunt for evidence? I mean, how do you put something as private as your own experience under a scientific microscope? Let's head into the lab and see how they do it.
And this really is the core challenge, isn't it? Consciousness is, well, it's subjective. I can't feel your excitement, you can't see my mental picture of the color blue. So how in the world do you build a solid experiment around something you can't even directly observe?
Well, for decades, the go-to method has been this clever little setup called contrastive analysis. Here's how it works. You show someone a really faint image, so faint that they only catch it about half the time. And then you just ask them, did you see it? Yes or no? And by comparing the brain activity when they say seen versus when they say unseen, the difference, well, in theory, that difference should be the NCC, the spark of awareness.
But, and this is a huge but, there was a massive problem that stumped researchers for years. When a person says, yep, I saw it, is the brain activity you're measuring the actual little flicker of awareness itself, or is it all the other stuff that comes after, making a decision, getting ready to press a button, thinking about what you saw? You might just be measuring the consequences of being conscious, not the pure experience.
So to solve this, scientists came up with these brilliant no-report paradigms. Instead of asking someone what they saw, they track objective things that are tied to perception. For example, your pupils actually change size, or your eyes will involuntarily track a moving pattern, but only if you're consciously seeing it. This lets them figure out what a person is experiencing without ever having to ask them. It's so clever.
So, armed with these clever new tools, researchers dove right back into the brain. And what they found kicked off one of the biggest debates in the entire field, a real scientific showdown between the front of the brain and the back.
So on one side, you've got the front camp. They're mostly aligned with that global neuronal workspace theory. They argue that for you to be aware of something, signals from the back of your brain, your sensory areas, they need to be amplified and broadcast by the prefrontal cortex up at the front. But on the other side, you've got the back camp, and they argue that no, all you really need is the right kind of complex activity back in those sensory areas themselves. The front of the brain, they say, that's just for reporting and deciding what to do, not for the experience itself.
And this is exactly where those no-report experiments dropped a bombshell. A really big study in 2014 did this. They tracked perception without asking for a report, and they found something pretty stunning. The brain activity that was linked to reporting the experience, the stuff in the frontal lobes, it completely vanished. But the activity that correlated with the experience itself,
That stayed strong right in the back of the brain.
I mean, the results were just so striking. When people had to actively report what they saw, both the front and the back of the brain lit up like a Christmas tree. But in that no report condition, when they were just passively experiencing it, that frontal activity just, poof, disappeared. The activity in the back, though, it was still there. This was a huge point for the back camp.
But of course, you know how science works. One study is never the final word. Other experiments have definitely found that strong, sustained activity in the frontal cortex is a really reliable marker of whether something was consciously seen or not. So yeah, the mystery of where consciousness lives in the brain is far from solved.
So this ongoing debate, right? This back and forth about where consciousness is, it's pushed a lot of scientists to stop and ask a totally different question. What if the key isn't a place in the brain at all? What if consciousness isn't about location, but it's about a specific pattern of information?
So now, a lot of researchers are focusing on the dynamics of brain activity, not the where, but the how. And they're finding that conscious experience seems to need a few key informational ingredients. One is recurrent processing, which just means information isn't a one-way street, it loops back and forth between different parts of the brain. Another is that different brain areas have to hum together in sync over long distances. And finally, something called differentiation, which is just a fancy way of saying the brain is in a highly complex state, able to hold tons of very specific, unique perceptions.
And this brings us right back to integrated information theory. Its main claim is that consciousness is integrated information. It's the information that's created by a whole system working together, and it's more than the sum of its parts. You can't just break it down into little pieces without losing the information. Just like you can't understand a sentence by just looking at each letter by itself. The meaning, the experience, it only exists when it's all together.
And here is the absolutely wild part. IIT says we can actually measure this. The proposed amount of this integrated information is called phi. The theory claims that any system, whether it's a brain or a computer, with a phi that's greater than 0 has at least some tiny spark of consciousness, and a higher phi means a richer, more complex experience. It's just a breathtaking attempt to take this deep mystery of consciousness and capture it with a single number.
And so we're left with this really crucial idea. If consciousness isn't tied to some kind of magical brain stuff, but instead it's a property of how information is organized and integrated, well, that changes everything. It opens up this profound kind of startling possibility that one day we might not just understand consciousness, but we might actually be able to build it. And that is a thought to carry with you.